My name is Helen. I'm 61 years old. Last Tuesday, my own son stood in my kitchen, looked me straight in the eyes, and asked me to sign a piece of paper. He smiled when he said it. That's the part I keep coming back to. He smiled, the same easy smile he's had since he was 6 years old, and he said, "Mom, it's just for your safety." 3 days later, I discovered he had been telling everyone, the neighbors, my own doctor, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, that I was losing my mind. I taught high school literature for 31 years. Chekhov, Ibsen, the quiet devastations tucked inside a well-built sentence. I spent my career teaching teenagers to notice the small details a story hands you early on, the ones that don't seem important yet, the ones that turn out to explain everything by the final chapter. I never once imagined I'd need those skills for my own life. But that's exactly what happened, the autumn after my husband died, in the house we'd raised our son in together. My silver blonde hair, my husband Walter used to say, still catches the porch light exactly the way it did the day I met her. He's been gone 8 months now. Our son, Michael, moved back into town shortly after the funeral, ostensibly to help me adjust. He brought groceries some weeks. He fixed a leaky faucet once. And the entire time, quietly, patiently, he was building a story about me that had almost nothing to do with a woman actually living in that house. It started small. A comment to a neighbor about how I'd seemed a little foggy lately. A remark to my own physician, during what I thought was simply a routine visit Michael had insisted on driving me to, about how I'd forgotten his birthday this year, which was, in fact, a complete fabrication. I had sent a card, 2 weeks early, the way I always did. My doctor, a kind but overworked man who sees 100 patients a week, took my son's concerned tone at face value and suggested, gently, that we might consider a cognitive baseline evaluation, just to be safe. I agreed to it. I had nothing to hide, and at the time, I genuinely believed my son was worried about me. That's the part that still stings the most, if I'm honest. Not the scheme itself, but how completely I trusted the person building it. There were other small moments, too, that I only understood in hindsight. He started calling every single evening, at almost exactly the same time, asking questions that seemed caring on the surface but were, I realized later, a kind of quiet testing. "What did you have for lunch, Mom? Did you take your vitamins? Do you remember what day it is?" I answered every one of them patiently, flattered, honestly, that my grown son wanted to check in so often after losing his father. I had no idea I was being evaluated, week after week, for a diagnosis that didn't exist. He also began, very gradually, inserting himself into conversations I'd never asked him to be part of. He came with me to the bank one afternoon, just to help carry things, and I noticed, weeks later, that the teller had started addressing certain questions to him instead of me, as though some invisible authority had already shifted hands in that room without my consent. He asked, more than once, whether I'd like him to just hold on to my checkbook for safekeeping, phrased so casually, so lovingly, that saying no felt almost unkind. The house Walter and I bought 34 years ago, back when the street was still half farmland, is now worth just under $1 million. I didn't think about that number often. It was simply the place I'd raised a child in, buried a husband from, planted 40 years of tomatoes and roses in the same stubborn patch of backyard soil. But somewhere in the 8 months since Walter's funeral, that number had apparently become the only thing my son could think about. I found this out entirely by accident, on a Thursday evening, when I came downstairs for a glass of water and heard Michael on the phone in the kitchen, speaking to someone I later learned was a real estate agent he'd already been in contact with for weeks. As soon as the guardianship goes through, he was saying, voice low, businesslike, nothing at all like the gentle, worried tone he used with me, "We can list the house. I think we're looking at maybe 6 weeks, tops, once the evaluation results come back the way we need them to." I stood in the hallway in my robe and slippers, one hand against the wall, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. Not panic. I want to be clear about that. What I felt, standing there, was something closer to the sensation of finishing a novel and finally understanding, all at once, everything the author had been quietly setting up since page 1. Every small kindness. Every doctor's visit. Every comment to a neighbor. It had all been leading here, to this exact conversation, in my own kitchen, about a guardianship that would legally declare me unable to manage my own affairs, so that my own son could sell the roof over my head. I went back upstairs without making a sound. And I did not sleep at all that night. Here is what 31 years of teaching literature actually gives a person, in the end. Not just an appreciation for a well-constructed sentence. A very particular kind of patience. The understanding that the truth of a story rarely reveals itself in one dramatic moment, it accumulates, quietly, detail by detail, until the pattern becomes impossible to deny. I decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that if my son wanted to build a case against my mind, I would simply build a better one in my favor, made entirely of things that were true. I bought a plain black notebook the next morning and began keeping a record. Dates, exact wording of conversations, written down within minutes of them happening, while my memory of them was still sharp, which, ironically, was the very thing my son was telling people I no longer had. I started saving text messages, printing emails, requesting copies of my own bank statements to prove I had never once missed a payment, forgotten a bill, or made a purchase I couldn't clearly account for. I asked my neighbor, Dottie, who had known me for 11 years, to write down, in her own words, what our recent conversations had actually been like, not the version Michael had apparently been feeding her, but the real one, where I'd remembered her granddaughter's wedding date before she did. I called my old book club, the one I'd hosted every third Thursday for nearly a decade, and asked each of them, gently, whether they'd noticed anything different about me lately. Every single one of them said no. Several of them, once I explained why I was asking, offered on the spot to put it in writing. By the end of 3 weeks, I had a folder. A thick one. Bank statements showing careful, consistent financial management. Written statements from neighbors and friends. A printed transcript, reconstructed from memory but dated and detailed, of the phone call I'd overheard in my own kitchen. Copies of emails Michael had sent to a real estate agent, which I obtained, I'll admit without much guilt, by glancing at his laptop screen one evening while he stepped out to take another call. The day Michael brought a different doctor to the house, not my usual physician, but someone new, a specialist he'd apparently found and scheduled entirely without my involvement, I could see it in his face the moment he walked through the door. He was hoping to catch me off guard. Confused. Fragile. The version of me he'd been describing to everyone for months. I'd had 2 days' warning, thanks to a slip on his part. He'd mentioned the appointment to Dottie in passing, assuming, incorrectly, that she'd simply pass along a friendly reminder to me rather than immediately walking next door to tell me exactly what was being planned. Those 2 days gave me time to make sure every document was printed, every page in order, every date double-checked against my notebook. I remember standing in my own kitchen the night before, arranging that folder for perhaps the 10th time, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all of it. Not fear. Something closer to the calm, focused readiness I used to feel the night before handing back a stack of final essays, the particular satisfaction of having done careful, honest work. I met them both in the living room, tea already prepared, seated calmly in Walter's old armchair by the window where the afternoon light comes in exactly the way it always has. Michael made the introductions, his voice carrying that same careful, concerned warmth he'd perfected over the last 8 months. The doctor took a seat, opened a folder of her own, and began, gently, to explain that she'd like to ask me a few questions, just routine, nothing to worry about. Before we begin, I said, setting down my tea, I'd like to show you something. I placed my own folder on the coffee table between us. I watched Michael's expression shift, very slightly, the way a person's face changes when a plan they've been quietly building for months suddenly meets something they didn't account for. I walked the doctor through it, page by page, the same way I once walked a classroom of 17-year-olds through the structure of a difficult text. The bank statements, showing a woman who had paid every bill on time for 8 consecutive months without her son's assistance. The written statements from neighbors and friends. The reconstructed transcript of the phone call about the guardianship and the house listing, dated the same week Michael had scheduled my first cognitive evaluation. The printed emails to the real estate agent, timestamps clearly visible, referencing an anticipated closing date once the paperwork is finalized. The doctor read through all of it in near silence, occasionally glancing up at Michael, whose careful, concerned expression had, by that point, entirely dissolved. "Mrs. Carter," she said finally, closing the folder, "I don't believe a cognitive evaluation is necessary today." She looked, briefly, at my son, and something passed across her own face that I recognized instantly, having spent 3 decades reading the exact moment a room full of teenagers realized they'd been caught in a story that didn't add up. "I think," she added carefully, I have all the information I need. The guardianship petition never moved forward. Once an independent medical professional puts her own name on a written statement confirming full cognitive competency, and once that statement sits alongside a folder full of dated, corroborated evidence, the entire legal foundation Michael had spent months quietly constructing simply collapsed. His attorney, I later learned, withdrew from the case within the week, citing concerns about the underlying facts he'd been given. Michael didn't come back to the house after that day. Not the following week, not the week after. He called, eventually, weeks later, not to apologize, but to ask, carefully, what my plans were regarding the property. I told him, as calmly as I've told a student the correct interpretation of a closing paragraph, that the property was mine, that it would remain mine, and that I would be deciding its future entirely on my own terms. He tried, once more, a few weeks after that, showing up unannounced on a Sunday afternoon with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and an expression I recognized instantly from 31 years of watching teenagers try to talk their way out of a failing grade. He said he'd overreacted, that he'd been scared after losing his father, that he'd only ever wanted to make sure I was taken care of. I let him finish. I've always believed in letting a person finish their sentence, even when you already know exactly how it ends. Then I told him, gently but plainly, that I understood grief could make people do strange things, but that grief didn't explain a folder of real estate emails, or a specialist scheduled behind my back, or 8 months of quiet, deliberate storytelling to everyone in my life except me. He left without the flowers. I don't think either of us expected him to take them back with him, but somehow, watching him drive away still holding that cheap little bouquet, I felt something close to closure I hadn't expected to feel that day. I sold the house myself, 3 months later, to a young family with 2 children who reminded me, in small ways, of Michael and his sister at that age, back before any of this. I didn't sell it because I couldn't manage it. I sold it because 34 years is a long time to live inside one set of memories, and I found, once I'd stopped defending my right to stay, that I actually wanted something smaller. Something new. I bought a modest stone cottage 2 towns over, with a garden just large enough for roses and a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs, though most evenings now, only one of them is occupied, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I don't mind that nearly as much as I once feared I would. With some of what remained from the sale, I started something I'd wanted to do since the day I retired from teaching. A free book club, open to any retiree in town who wanted somewhere warm to go on a Tuesday afternoon, coffee and shortbread and whatever novel we'd chosen that month, no fee, no requirements, just the same quiet joy I used to find in a classroom, minus the grading. We meet in the library's community room now, 11 of us most weeks, sometimes more. Daddy comes every time. We're reading Chekhov this month, as it happens. I think Walter would have found that particular detail very funny. Some of the women in that room, I've come to learn over quiet cups of coffee after the discussion winds down, have stories not so different from mine. A daughter who just wants to help manage things. A nephew who keeps mentioning, a little too often, how much the family home must be worth these days. I don't lecture anyone. I simply mention, when it feels right, how useful a plain black notebook can be, and watch something shift, very slightly, behind their eyes, the particular look of a person realizing they're not imagining things after all. I don't know exactly what happened to Michael. I heard, through my daughter, that he's living 2 states away now, working for a property management company, of all things. I don't feel anger toward him anymore, not really. I feel something closer to a very specific kind of sadness, the sort you feel finishing a novel where a character had every opportunity to become someone better, and simply chose not to. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to remember, it's something I used to tell my students every single September, on the very first day of class, before we'd even opened our first book together. Pay attention to what a person does, not just what they say, especially when what they're saying sounds like love. My son called it safety. He called it care. He called it concern, over and over, right up until the moment a folder on my coffee table proved otherwise. Sometimes, the people trying hardest to prove you're losing your mind are simply afraid you'll discover theirs.